Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our weekly sermonette. This week, I'd like to talk about actually a individual who passed away last week. Passed away. His funeral was last Friday in Jerusalem. Rabbi Adin Even Yisrael, otherwise known as Rabbi Steinsaltz. And yesterday, when they got up from Shiva, they actually had a unveiling of his tombstone. And I'm holding here in my hand a picture, and I don't know if you can see it, but if you notice, it's very, very little written on his tombstone. Period. There's a big blank space in the middle. And I'd like to talk about what does say here, what doesn't say here. And actually, if you look very closely, actually his name Steinsaltz doesn't say here. It says here, here lies Poinethan Ishrav Pa'alim, a man of great accomplishments. And then it has his name, Adin, Alav Shalom, Even Yisrael. Many people know, some people don't know, that for the last 30 years of his life, he went by a different last name. He went by the name Even Yisrael, and that is what I will be talking about today, how that name change came about and why, and what the significance is to this week's Torah portion and our lives. But actually the name Steinsaltz is not mentioned here, and then it says who his parents were. And he was such a humble individual, a man of amazing accomplishment, probably one of the modern Jewry's most prolific and authoritative scholars of this generation. But all it says here is that he opened the gates of Torah and brought the light of Torah to all, and that he was a dedicated chassid, connected with by heart and soul to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And then it says he passed through Yerushalayim, the 3rd of Menachem Av. He was born the 3rd of Menachem Av, 1937, and he passed away the 17th of Menachem Av this year. And then there's a quote. A lot of times you put a verse, and the family chose here to put a quote actually from the Rebbe about Rabbi Steinsaltz, which is that the Rebbe says that he found in him unbelievable virtues more than what people describe about him. And it concludes with the letters Tafnun Sadik Beis Hey, may his soul be bound in the bond of life. Now, this is not really about Rabbi Steinsaltz, Rabbi Even Yisrael. What I'd like to talk about is the name change. Basically, Rabbi Steinsaltz grew up in a secular home. His parents were not religious. At the age of 10 years old, his father hired a tutor to teach him Talmud. And his father told him, be an atheist, but don't be an ignoramus. And long story short, at the age of 15, he actually ditched high school and he connected with Chabad, went to a Chabad yeshiva, returned to Judaism, to the observance of Judaism, and one of his most, he became, his world recognition came about because he was the first to take on this monumental task of actually translating the Talmud. He started his project in 1965. He didn't finish it until, 1967, and he didn't finish it until 2011. For those that have studied Talmud, this would be obvious, but even for a yeshiva student, the Talmud is a mix of Hebrew and Aramaic, but even if you understand Hebrew, it is very, very difficult to decipher a page of Talmud without assistance, and that's really what he did. He took the monumental task of translating the Talmud to a simple approach that every student should be able to open it and learn it. And he thought it was going to take him quicker. It ended up taking 45 years. And besides that, he's taken on many other projects and translated many other books and written prolifically. But that's not really, and a humble individual. Anybody who's met him, he's been here to Memphis several times. But he was a humble real humble individual. But the question, actually, he ended up traveling for the first time to meet the Lubavitcher Rebbe was in 1970, and from then was a very devout chassid, really strongly connected to the Rebbe. He even described once that he never asked the Rebbe for anything personal because he didn't want to take the Rebbe's time, but the Rebbe always inquired about his personal life, and so on and so forth. I spent some time last night on a live Zoom call with several of his students and different individuals talking about the greatness of Rabbi Steinsaltz, Joseph Telushkin, and others that were on that program, both from all around the world. And his son spoke as well. But I digress. How did he get the name changed? So what happened was, in 1990, he came to visit the Rebbe, and it was on the 9th day of Shvat, roughly February of 1990, when the Rebbe used to give out dollars and meet people and give them blessings. And when he went by the Rebbe, out of the blue gave him a suggestion that perhaps he should change his name. That the name Steinsaltz is stone salt in Yiddish, but sort of it has a negativity to it. And the Rebbe recommended that perhaps you should change your name, and that came out of the blue. And the Rebbe said, think about it, discuss it with your spouse, with your wife, and and it was just a short, brief encounter, and that was that. A couple of months later, he found out and realized why the Rebbe wanted his name changed. A short while later, his son was diagnosed with a leukemia, and it didn't look good. It looked really bad. And he realized that that's what the Rebbe was hinting to him, to change his name. So the idea of when somebody's ill, we have a name change. We'll talk about that in a moment. So he decided to change his name. And he changed his name to something positive, and he referred to himself as Even Yisrael, the Rock of Israel, which really is really very befitting. He was an amazing scholar and authority of Judaism in our times. So he changed his name to Even Yisrael. And a couple of months later, in November of 1990, in the month of Cheshvan, he came back to the Rebbe. At this point, his son was still ill, and he went there with he asked the Rebbe for a bracha for his son, and the Rebbe gave him a bracha for his son. And then the Rebbe asked him, "Have you changed your name?" And he told the Rebbe, yes, he changed his name to Even Yisrael. He asked him, "Has your son also taken on this new surname?" And he goes, yes. He says, "Is it exclusively?" He goes, yes. He says, "Did the whole family do so?" He goes, yes. When the Rebbe heard that, the Rebbe gave him a bracha and a blessing that the son should be well and healthy, and so on and so forth. Now, this idea of, if you want to say, you have to realize that a name change for somebody like somebody of that stature, and somebody who's built up his name, to then all of a sudden change his name, is basically erasing his history and his accomplishments. Even till today, his Talmud was known as the Steinsaltz, not by he referred to himself as Even Yisrael. His family went by Even Yisrael from then on, but it was so monumental that a lot of people refer to that still as well by that name. So erasing, changing his name is really changing everything that he's accomplished until that point. But changing a name is not something new. I mean, if we go back to the first Jew, Avraham, we find the idea that God told him to change his name from Avram to Avraham. His wife's name was changed from Sarai to Sarah. And we know the story, they couldn't have children. And when they changed the name, they were blessed with children. And the idea is basically that Avram and Sarai were not destined to have children. It was not in their fortune to have children. On the other hand, Avraham and Sarah are new entities, new people with a different, with a different mazel. Mazel is a flow of energy that comes from above. And therefore, these people, these new entities, are a new concept, and these people are blessed to have children. Now we find that interestingly in modern times as well, when somebody is unfortunately very, very ill, a lot of times a name would be added. Their nutrient, their spiritual lifeline in a sense, comes through a person's name, and that is changed, and their spiritual lifeline is changed as well. What was unique in this particular case is that usually people change their first name. Here the Rebbe asked him to change his last name, and perhaps his last name was more of his identity. I don't know the reason. Last names is only a modern concept of the last 200 years. It wasn't until the 1800s that people started having this inherent last name that people keep. As a matter of fact, the first Chabad Rebbe, Reb Schneur Zalman, was known as Baruchovich. But the reason is because his father was known as Baruch. In ancient times, people were known, like if your father's name was Ruvain, your last name might be Ruveni. So the first Chabad Rebbe, his father was Baruch, so he was known as Baruchovich. Reb Schneur Zalman's son, which was his successor, the second Chabad Rebbe, he actually went by Shnei Uri. His father's name was Schneur. And it wasn't until the third Chabad Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, Rabbi Menachem Mendel, who was the first to have the name Schneer's son, which the name speaks for itself. His father was Shnei Uri. He was the son of Schneur, and from then that has been the family name. So what was unique here in this case is the idea that the name change was the last name. But by giving that name change, their entity changed and their existence changed. They became new entities, and thank God, I'm happy to tell you that actually his son had a miraculous recovery. And as a matter of fact, last night on this event that they had, the Zoom event in honor of Rabbi Evan Yisrael, Rabbi Adin, his son was on there, spoke, and he's the one that actually took over the foundation of the publications and so on and so forth. To the point, as I say, this name change was so strong that even on his tombstone, it does not say Steinsaltz, it just says Rabbi Din Evan Yisrael. Now, this idea of change, which takes us to this week's Torah portion, this idea of changing, conceptually changing, drastically leaving one idea or concept behind and embracing a totally new way of whether it's your identity or how you relate to Torah and to God is found in this week's Torah portion. In this week's Torah portion, the Torah portion is called Re'eh, see. It comes from the first verses of the Parsha, Re'eh Anochi Nosen Lefneichem Hayom. God is saying that, see that I put before you today. Now, it's interesting that this is the first time that we're using the expression see. Till now, the Torah has always been using the idea of Shema. Hear, listen. Just a few weeks ago, we had the Torah portion of the Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel. And since then, we have 3 other times where the Torah refers to and keeps saying hear, listen, hear. The verses, now this is the first time see. What's the difference between hearing something versus seeing something is huge. One can be contradicted, if you want to say. I'll give you an analogy. If you heard something from somebody, somebody else could come and make the argument that it didn't happen, and now you have 2 opinions, and you question the first. So for example, if we're sitting here now and all of a sudden you hear this loud noise and somebody comes and says, well, an aircraft just went very, very low on top of where we find ourselves now, I would hear it makes sense. It sounded like an aircraft. But somebody else could come and tell you, no, there's loudspeakers outside that made that sound. And they can make a good argument that it wasn't actually an aircraft. It was just the sound from speakers. But if you stood outside and you saw the aircraft, then no argument can be made. Nobody can come and make an argument that it was only speakers. You saw the aircraft with your own eyes. It's undeniable. Now, in our relation to God, when it comes to our faith, there's also these 2 ideas, the idea of hearing and the idea of seeing. All of us have heard that there's a God. We've heard that there's a creator. Our parents have taught it to us. Maybe we heard it in Hebrew school. Maybe we heard it in a rabbi's sermon. And we hear The only problem with hearing is that, you know what, somebody could along our life could come along and make a good argument, perhaps, that, you know, that we can question the existence of the God or the power of God. And on the other hand, if you experience the miracle, if you had the opportunity where you literally felt and saw God holding your hand and walking alongside you, there's no doubt that God exists, and you know that God exists. That is the difference between hearing of God's existence and seeing God's existence. And that is really what the Torah portion is here telling us, that at this point, there's a maturity that we come. Till now, it's been one experience. There's a maturity that has to come, that we have to lift ourselves up to the next level, not to know it knowledge in a knowledge way, but really to know it in a way that we see it with our own eyes, God's existence. And you know what? We find ourselves now in a very interesting time. The time that we find ourselves, I think it's a time that people stop and reflect and ask, and we can look into our lives and find those times where it's not just we hear that God exists, we hear that God is in control of everything. One thing for sure, it's not in our control, and it is in someone's control, and that is God's control. As I've been saying and said last week, you know, God has not left the cockpit, but we need to see it. We need to feel it. We need to know it in a way that it cannot be denied. We have to lift ourselves up to that level. And when we do, we merit the blessings and the great blessings that God promises us, that when we see it in that way, if we can lift ourselves up to that level to be able to see, you know, till now we've been at the level of Shema Yisrael. Here, listen, now we're lifting ourselves to the level of where we should open ourselves up to be able to the level of seeing it with our own eyes, a much greater, higher awareness of God, and to be able to see God in everything that happens to us, and really bringing us to that level really will bring us true calm, true peace, true harmony, true connection, and most importantly, as if we could change ourselves to that concept, we become a new entity. And just like we said the story, when you change your name, you become a new entity, new blessings, new miracles. May we merit in our lives also peace, harmony, healing, all the blessings that we need from God in a revealed way, that we should be able to see it with our own eyes. And may we merit to be able to see the end of this galus and see godliness in everything that exists in a revealed way with the coming of Mashiach. May it be speedily in our days. Amen. Good Shabbos and Shabbat Shalom.